So when we're thinking about tree root development in particular, we're mainly looking at taproot systems, oblique or heart root systems, and lateral or flat root systems. There's also sinker roots, kind of sinker root systems that I'll explain in a second. Fine roots are more characteristic of grasses and herbaceous vegetation. So, I mean, as we can see, there's a taproot systems have a most trees when they're germinating, they'll all have a radical that forms kind of a taproot early on. But what distinguishes taproot systems that is that they persist, and that main taproot can persist for many years. Whereas if you have an oblique or a heart root system, even early on in that seedling's life, it's going to be producing multiple taproots or kind of oblique roots that are going kind of in between vertical orientations and horizontal orientations. With sinker roots, you're going to have species that produce coarse roots that form off of lateral roots and go straight down. And then with lateral or flat root species or surface rooting species, they might have a taproot early on, but that's aborted pretty quickly, and they focus most of their structural root growth in the surface soil. So that's just a quick primer on these types of root systems. What we see mainly in urban settings, however, is that surface rooting is the dominant morphology, and that's just the reality of compacted soils, more or less. Even if a taprooting species would like to send its taproot deep into the soil, it might not be able to. So when we see shallow lateral roots forming early in propagation, we need to be cognizant that those roots, especially in urban settings, are going to they're going to thicken and form the key structural roots throughout that tree's life. Of course, those structural roots, as we talked about, also they're the framework that supports much more short-lived fine roots. Fine roots can live a matter of weeks. They'll form and die, make associations with soil organisms, and acquire nutrients and water. Uh, but we need that framework. We need roots that are well distributed to persist and keep growing in a framework that's beneficial for the tree's long-term strategy. And we need those to form early on and persist. So basically, what I'll talk about in the next couple of slides is the importance of root distribution from an early age. And of course, soil type, a really sandy versus a really fine textured soil will influence moisture and will influence the ability of roots to explore that soil. And of course, there's also barriers such as rocks or sidewalks or geotextile fabrics, especially in urban settings, that's going to influence that. Um, so, alluding to this last diagram here, soil depth, the depth of rooting of roots and root systems is important in lots of different settings. So I grabbed this diagram. I liked it from the book called Roots Demystified. And to be honest, I'm not sure what these units are, but basically what they're depicting is that a lot of the nutrient cycling and all the functions that soil organisms are providing is occurring at a much higher rate in those first few inches of topsoil. And we all generally know that, but it kind of makes sense when you think of how much lateral root growth you see even in a heavy taprooting species. They're associating with that top few inches of soil. So here I've included a few sketches from a really cool book that we stumbled upon. It's online a few years ago, called Tree Root Systems in Eastern Nebraska. It was published in 1979, but it was based on root system excavations that were undertaken during the Great Depression, if my memory is serving me correct. It was kind of a make work project, but it's provided some really valuable sketches of root systems growing in different kinds of soils, all obviously within eastern Nebraska, but lots of different species. There's like 100 different sketches. I've just included a few. So here's one of those heavy or dominant taprooting species, a drought-adapted species, Bur Oak. And on the first sketch, you see how prominent that taproot is, each one of those grids, it represents a square foot. So you've got the taproot going down 5 feet in a silt loam soil after 3 years. And that tree is only 3.5 feet tall. And then they dug out a much larger tree, which is really amazing that they did this, an 80-year-old tree. And you can still see that really dominant taproot, but you can also see tons of lateral roots at different depths going out much further in terms of total distance than the taproot is exploring vertically. In a less dominant taprooting species such as hackberry, you can see a smaller taproot that clearly formed early in its life there, but you can see that it doesn't go down too deep. Uh, you can see this is a 7-year-old hackberry tree that they dug up in clay loam soil. It's a 6 foot tall tree, but it's got roots going down about 6 feet. But as you can see from the top view they provide there, that it's got a really excellent root distribution of lateral roots going out in like every 30 to 50 degrees. You go around the circle, you have a nice structural root. And then here's a 25-year-old hackberry they dug up, 19 feet tall, out of the silt loam soil. And I like this one because it just shows got a kind of a similar shape, but you can see that the roots on one side have found, nicer soil or more water, more just a better soil to explore. So it's kind of double or triple the biomass on one side. And lastly, the green ash, that one of them that they dug up, a 4 foot tall, 3-year-old green ash, growing in silt loam again, it's got a 4 foot long, 4 foot long kind of taproot, but the taproot kind of split off into a few different ones, and then it's also got excellent distribution. So I particularly like looking at naturally formed root systems. They're all going to be a bit different, but they're going to provide the kind of the images of what we would, at least some of the features we'd like to see produced in, unnaturally produced, I mean, in container production, where we are obviously controlling some of the conditions and we're making the soil volume much smaller. So I also wanted to include this slide really quickly, because when we think about these, the functions of a root system, obviously we think first of, at least I think first of resource acquisition, like water and nutrients. But the structural stability that a coarse root system provides for a tree is also really important. So in that top left, we see like a main taproot and then a bunch of well-distributed laterals, kind of like that Bur Oak that we saw. And that's characterized as a pretty stable system, even if there's a windstorm. Obviously, if you remove a bunch of those laterals and that taproot isn't as vigorous, you're going to have a much less stable root system. And then also, if you start considering, a lot of trees produce these sinker roots that grow down vertically off of lateral roots. And I mean, you've got a really stable system if you've on that bottom left, but on the bottom right, what should be a pretty stable system in a pretty mature tree, after several years that it's been growing, probably a few decades, is actually not all that stable because it's missing coarse lateral structural roots on one whole side. So then, to kind of wrap things up in terms of what we saw with coming out of that 2017 nursery trial in the greenhouse that Charlene showed you guys the photos of. I've just included photos of the eastern cottonwood seedlings that we grew, and we grew them, of course, in RootSmart trays, but we also grew them in a closed wall, kind of a standard closed wall tray with a very similar cell size to the RootSmart. It had a small drainage hole at the bottom and a 4 ribs to try to prevent circling around it, but other than that, it was completely solid wall. And so you'll notice kind of the general shapes of these root systems have a lot of laterals that formed not a prominent taproot, but kind of multiple taproots and multiple lateral roots, many of which got deflected downwards and formed a kind of cage-like structure. That's kind of the typical shape we saw. You also see on the far right, that seedling also have a kind of a kinked or ascending root. And then in the RootSmart seedlings, we tended to see kind of a more of a like a main taproot that got air pruned quite nicely at the bottom, and then formed some lateral roots moving up that taproot and air pruning actually reasonably nicely despite the pretty wet conditions throughout most of the growing season. So what that looks like after we outplanted these seedlings in the fall of 2017, and then we dug up a few of them at the end of the growing season in 2018 to see what they looked like and to analyze them. And here's a few photos of um, closed wall eastern cottonwood trees. They're not the same seedlings or anything, but they're kind of randomly selected. And on the top, you get a top view to see what the kind of the lateral distribution looks like. And then on the side view, you see what ended up happening as this very fast growing eastern cottonwood species, uh, as its structural roots filled out and got thicker. And especially in that middle uh, that middle sapling, you can see that a lot of that cage structure really kind of formed, and a lot of those roots kind of came out at the bottom of the root system. You can also see kind of evidence of, we saw this rarely, but we saw it sometimes, of an ascending kind of kinked root too. Generally, if you're looking for the distribution, it's kind of, it doesn't look too terrible, but there's a lot of defects that are formed in that root ball, and all those roots are coming out kind of kinked at the bottom. Whereas when we look at the RootSmart trees, and I'll show you, we've got three of them here too. I mean, every root system is going to look very different, but what we noticed kind of right off the bat is um, really nice air pruning at the bottom of the taproot. Especially, you can see it on number 135 on the right there. If you look at the bottom of that tree, it's split off into about three or four different coarse roots, and form some persistent laterals going straight out from the taproot. Yeah, and just to, I mean, one other quick point about this, if you look at number 45, it has pretty good root distribution. You can see one kind of lateral in the front side view there that it seems to be a descending root that's kind of kinked inwards. That may have formed due to the overly wet conditions, or it could also be an artifact of the hand planting we did in that type of soil. It could have also created some kind of compaction around the roots. So to kind of sum up, to leave a couple minutes for questions, we found tree root. We obviously know that tree root development starts early in propagation, and that morphology is determined by a combination of genetics and environment. That root distribution can impact the acquisition of resources and stability. That deflected roots in propagation are often sustained in the field after planting, and we'll be digging up trees for the next 2 falls as well. So we'll have data going to 2021, so 4 years in the field, which is really nice. And that negative impacts of deflected coarse roots on nursery stock quality features such as growth, or future stability of these trees, it might only become apparent after several years, or maybe after a decade or two. That's what we're looking to find out. So far, we haven't seen any growth differences in terms of above ground growth or below ground growth, but we're looking to test out stability and kind of longer term growth.